Welcome to Lecture 11, Part 2, where we will continue our discussion of short distance navigation. We started that last time by focusing on cognitive maps as well as landmarks, and in this part I'm going to be focusing on the sun compass as well as dead reckoning, or also known as path integration. And what we'll see is that dead reckoning actually seems to make use of the sun compass as one of its components. But let's start with the sun compass, and although many species seem to make use of the sun compass, I want to focus on how honeybees make use of it. And this is because bees, as you might have guessed already in this course, are my favorite experimental animal. And the fact that they use a sun compass is evident from their waggle dance, which I'll discuss and decode in a moment. But basically, bees are able to represent and communicate the location of a food source at a certain angle, either to the left or to the right of the sun's projection onto the horizon. That sounds very abstract, but we can make it concrete by looking at the figure in the slide, right? So the sun projects onto the horizon, right? You can draw a line from the sun to the horizon. And you can make a line from the hive to that point where the sun projects onto the horizon, and another line from the hive to the location of the food. Right, so you can draw an angle, right, from the with the hive as the vertex, and the size of the angle, either to the left or to the right, tells you the direction to the food source. In this case, you know that the food source is 80 degrees to the right of the sun. So bees are able to go back to their hive after they find a food source, and they can convey to other bees the direction as well as the distance to this food source. But before we discuss how bees are able to do this, we need to discuss some of the complexities that have to be involved. Any animal, including humans, that navigates according to the sun has to take into account the fact that the sun's position changes throughout the day. Right? We know that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and it moves from east to west through the southern sky. So one of the things that changes about the sun's position relative to the horizon is the azimuth. Right, which is the angle of the sun's position relative to true north. So if true north is 0 degrees, when the sun rises in the east, its azimuth is 90 degrees, as you can see in the figure. And then midday, the azimuth would be 180 degrees. And then when the sun sets in the evening, its azimuth is 270 degrees. And the azimuth changes approximately 15 degrees per hour. Okay, so if you face south, the sun would move 15 degrees from the left to the right, 15 degrees every hour, approximately. So this means that if bees are able to reliably use the sun as a compass, they have to take into account the changing azimuth. Right, so they have to adjust the angle that they fly relative to the sun. Why is that? Because if they, let's say that the food source was found to be 80 degrees to the right of the sun at T1, and then let's say that 2 hours later they go back to that food source. If they flew 80 degrees to the right of the sun, they would overshoot the food source by 30 degrees. Why? Because the sun has shifted 30 degrees to the right. So what the bees would do is they would only fly 2 hours later 50 degrees to the right of the sun. And interestingly, this changing position of the sun is taken into account when they perform the waggle dance. Right, so they adjust the angle of the dance to take into account the changing position of the sun, and they seem to track the changing position of the sun using some kind of internal clock, a circadian clock. All right, so a little bit more about this waggle dance. As I said, it encodes distance and direction to a food source. The direction is given by the angle relative to the vertical. Right, so if you imagine in the hive a line from top of the hive to the bottom of the hive, that's a vertical line, and the angle of the dance relative to the vertical conveys the direction of the food source relative to the sun. And the distance is given by the number of waggles in the waggle run. And a waggle is that left-right vibration of their abdomen. So the waggle dance was first discovered and decoded by von Frisch. And as I said, the angle of the waggle run is altered, right, due to the internal clock to account for the changing position of the sun. And the waggle dance is represented on the left here. We can see it's got this figure 8 pattern. The waggle run is a central portion of the dance, the wavy line. That's the point where it vibrates its abdomen. And you can see that this one is being done at a certain angle relative to vertical, and it matches the angle of the food source relative to the sun. As I said, they adjust the angle that they perform the dance at to take into account the fact that the sun is moving in the sky. And I encourage you to copy and paste this link onto your browser so you can watch a YouTube video called The Dance Language of the Honeybee. It goes into much more detail, and it's best to see it as a video. But what I want to do now is briefly tell you about a study by Cheeseman and colleagues that actually shows that honeybees can use both a sun compass and landmark navigation to navigate. Landmark information to navigate. And the main point of their study is that bees know when to use these different kinds of information. Right, so if landmark information is available, that's what they use. And only when landmark information isn't available do they switch to using a sun compass. So they conducted an experiment with 2 groups of bees. One was a control group and the other was the time-shifted bees. And so the time shifting was done before the actual experiment. The time-shifted bees were put under general anesthetic for 6 hours. And general anesthetic is a fast way to mess up their circadian clock, right? So if you knock them out for 6 hours, when they wake up, they think that it's actually 6 hours earlier than it actually is. Right? So time shifting should mess up their sun compass, right? Because the sun compass takes into account time of day. So in general, this is what happened in the study, right? So the bees left the hive and they went to a feeder, and they had memorized this route to a feeder. They knew, for example, when I leave the hive, fly to the left, and that's where the feeder is, right? So they were trained to feed at this feeder. And then what happened was, when they left that feeder, they were captured and put in a dark compartment that they couldn't see out of, and they were transferred to another location where they couldn't see where they had been captured, and they couldn't see their hive. It was a featureless location. And the experiment was designed such that upon release, the bees would fly in the wrong direction until they hit a landmark that they recognize. And this would allow them to realize that they were flying in the wrong direction, and they'd be able to adjust and recalibrate and then find the hive. So these phrases are going to come up again and again when I discuss this, right? There's the pre-discovery and the post-discovery phase of the study. When a bee is first released after they're captured. That's the pre-discovery phase, because they haven't discovered a landmark that they recognize. Post-discovery is what the bees do after they discover a landmark. What's really cool about this study is that the bees were tracked using radar. And using radar, they were able to monitor their specific flight paths upon release. Right, stuff that you can't do without it. Alright, so the figure helps to make this clear. The figure shows the hive at H1, and F1 is the feeder that they had been trained to feed on. Right? They know exactly when they leave the hive, they know exactly what direction to fly to get to that feeder. They don't need a sun compass, they don't need anything, they know exactly which way to fly. So as they leave F1, they're captured and transferred to location R1 and released. And what you can see is the average paths that bees in each of the two groups took. The red path is the time-shifted bees, and the blue path is the control bees. And what you can also see is that both groups of bees eventually made it back to the hive, okay, after starting off in the wrong direction. Both groups went in the wrong direction at first and then ended up at the right location. But what's interesting is the two types of errors that were made. And as we'll see, this reflects the fact that the time-shifted bees were relying on the sun compass and led them in the wrong direction. But let's start with the control bees, right? When they were first released, before discovering this landmark that allowed them to get home, right? They flew in the direction that would have been right if it had been taken from the feeder at F1. Right? They flew in what would have been the right direction. But obviously it was not the right direction, right? But when they got to a landmark, right, which you can see here, the irrigation channel, right? When they got to that landmark, then they went in the direction of the hive and found their way home. What about the time-shifted bees? Right, when they were released, right, when they were first released in the pre-discovery phase, they flew at an almost 90-degree angle to the right of the path taken by the control bees. Right? Why did they do that? And you can see that here. Right? You can see that the angle of the bees, of the time-shifted bees relative to the control bees is almost 90 degrees. Not quite, but almost. Why would they do that? This makes sense on the assumption that they were relying on a sun compass, right? It makes sense because in 6 hours, the sun would have shifted approximately 90 degrees to the right. So you'd expect them to fly 90 degrees to the right of the control bees. But once they discovered a landmark that they recognized, they were also able to overwrite this erroneous sun compass and make their way home. Alright, so what the results show is that the sun compass is used and that honeybees take into account how much time has passed to calibrate for changing position of the sun. And importantly, as I said in the beginning, the sun compass is more likely to be used when there aren't any cues, any landmarks present, any distinctive features present that can be used to navigate. Right? Once landmarks are spotted, they seem to overwrite their sun compass, especially if it's providing them with inaccurate information. Right? So the time-shifted bees didn't continue making errors and continue getting even more lost once they discovered a landmark, right? They knew exactly which way to go. So this shows that in a brain the size of a grain of sand, there is some flexibility and there is some negotiating of strategies that are used in order to navigate, right? They aren't simply relying on blind mechanical processes. There is some subtlety involved. Alright, I want to end with a discussion of what's called dead reckoning, a behavior that has been observed in many species, including insects. So many species also navigate in a home range using dead reckoning or path integration. And basically it involves keeping track of distance and direction information, right? Distance and direction that's been traveled on a journey, so that an animal is constantly aware of what it has to do in order to get back home. And this is something that's been observed, for example, in desert ants. Very important for desert ants because the desert landscape, as you can imagine, is very uniform and flat and hard to see, where things are, where your nest is. So when these desert ants go looking for food, they'll leave their nest, they'll travel a circuitous path, and then they'll go directly home. This is a miracle of navigation that they don't get lost. Right, so here's a couple examples of paths that they might take. Right, in both cases, you can see that when they find food, they go directly back. They make a beeline for the start position. It doesn't matter how circuitous the path was either. Right, they still find their way directly home. As you'll notice, they don't have to retrace their steps. Right, so they've calibrated at each point where they have to go to get back home. Right, so some of the earliest strategies for studying this was using what's called the displacement paradigm. Right, so you pick up, after an ant finds food, you pick it up and you put it in a different location and you see what distance and direction it travels upon being released. And what you see is that they keep going in a direction and distance that would have been the right distance and direction if they had not been displaced. Right? And you can see this in this figure. So in this one, they leave the nest, they travel, on the left hand side, they leave the nest, they travel a circuitous path to a feeder, then they're displaced and put on a release point, and you can see they make a beeline at a certain angle and distance, and then when they get to where their nest would have been, you can see that they appear confused and start to walk around and doing a random search. Now what's interesting is that this dead reckoning seems to exploit the sun compass to some extent. Right? They use the sun compass to figure out direction to home, and they also seem to be implicitly counting steps in order to figure out the distance that's been traveled. So how do we know that ants are using a sun compass for direction when they're dead reckoning? Well, a study by Weistrack and colleagues looked at this. Desert ants, again, were the subjects, and they were tested using a displacement experiment. So when they found food, they were displaced to a different location. And what they did was they used mirrors, carefully placed mirrors, to confuse the ants as to the location of the sun. And they did so systematically. And they found that they could systematically make the ants go in the wrong direction by altering where the sun would be seen. Right, so when they indicated the wrong direction of the sun, the ants started to head in the wrong direction. Alright, so in today's class we discussed the sun compass in honeybees, and also we explored dead reckoning in ants, and we saw that this seems to make use of the sun compass to some extent.